She was bleeding from a wound she had not yet allowed herself to acknowledge, kneeling in the dust of a compound 12 miles past the last friendly checkpoint, with a SEAL operator twice her size unconscious in her lap, and a radio that had gone silent 4 minutes earlier. The men around her, hardened Tier 1 operators who had buried friends in 3 different countries, were waiting for her to fall. Not because they wanted her to. Because every instinct they had trained for 20 years told them she should have already. She was the only woman on the rooftop. She was the youngest. She was the medic. And the blood soaking through the side seam of her plate carrier was hers, though not one of them knew it yet, because she had not made a single sound since the blast. There is a moment in every soldier's life when the body decides one thing and the spirit decides another, and the world holds its breath to see which one wins. This was hers. And before she stood up, before she did what no one on that rooftop expected her to do, she whispered 6 words into the dust that would later be repeated in after-action reports. In classrooms at Fort Sam Houston, and in the quiet conversations of men who do not cry easily. What do you think a person says to themselves in the second before they choose to rise? Tell me in the comments. Her name was Staff Sergeant Elena Vargas, and long before she ever wore the patch of the 75th Ranger Regiment's medical attachment or earned the quiet nod of a SEAL team chief. She was a 15-year-old girl in a 2-bedroom apartment in San Antonio, watching her mother bandage a stranger's arm at 3 in the morning. Her mother was not a nurse. She was a housekeeper at a hospital, but she had paid attention every night for 19 years. And the people in their building knew that if something went wrong and the rent was due and the emergency room felt impossible, Marisol Vargas's kitchen table was the next best thing. Elena learned to fold gauze before she learned to drive. She learned the smell of iodine before she learned the smell of cologne. And she learned, watching her mother's calm hands work on a man who had been cut in a knife fight he did not want to talk about, that the most powerful thing a person can do in a room full of fear is not panic. Her father had left when she was 9, not in any dramatic way, just slowly, the way a tide goes out. Her older brother Marco had joined the army at 18 and come home from his second deployment with a quiet she did not understand until much later. When Marco sat at their mother's kitchen table one Sunday, looking at his hands like they belonged to someone else, Elena knew 2 things at once. She wanted to do whatever it was that he had done, and she wanted to be the person who could put men like him back together. She enlisted at 19, 3 months after her high school graduation, and chose the 68W military occupational specialty because the recruiter told her it was the hardest medical role in the regular army. Her drill sergeant at Fort Jackson was a woman named Sergeant First Class Dion Pickett, who had served in Mosul and Sadr City, and who told the recruits on their first morning that the uniform did not care what they had survived to get there, only what they were willing to survive next. Elena listened. She ran the obstacle course until her lungs felt scraped raw. She memorized the location of every artery in the human body until she could recite them in her sleep. When the other recruits complained about the food, she ate it without comment. When they complained about the cold, she added another layer and kept moving. By the time she graduated combat medic training at Fort Sam Houston, she had finished in the top 3 of her class. And a master sergeant pulled her aside after the ceremony and told her that the regiment was looking. He did not have to explain which regiment. She said yes before he finished the sentence, and that yes was the first door of the rest of her life. The Ranger Assessment and Selection Program was not designed for her, and that was, in a strange way, the point. Elena understood from the first morning at Fort Benning that no one in the cadre cared about her gender, her name, or the medals her brother kept in a shoebox in their mother's closet. They cared about whether her boots were still moving at hour 18 of a road march. They cared about whether she could think clearly while soaking wet and shaking from cold. She watched men twice her size quit in the first week, not because they were weak, but because somewhere inside them a quieter voice had finally been louder than the one that had pushed them through every other hard thing in their lives. Elena learned to make that voice smaller. She did it through repetition, through routine, through the small daily disciplines that nobody noticed and that added up to everything. She laid her gear out the same way every night. She drank water when she did not feel thirsty. She slept when she could and stayed awake when she had to, and she never, not once, complained out loud. Because she had decided early that complaints were a kind of debt the body collected interest on. Her first deployment was to eastern Afghanistan. Attached to a Ranger battalion conducting direct action raids out of a small fire base she would later describe only as cold and loud. She treated her first gunshot wound in the back of a striker. That smelled like diesel and adrenaline. Working by red light, because white light would have made them a target. The wounded man was a private from Ohio with a hole in his thigh the size of a quarter, and Elena, who had never before pressed her hands into a living person's bleeding leg, did exactly what she had been trained to do and did not allow herself to think about anything else. He lived. She wrote his name in a small notebook she kept in her left breast pocket, and she would keep that notebook for the next 8 years, adding a name every time she saved one and a different mark every time she could not. She earned the respect of the Rangers slowly, in the way respect is always earned in those circles, which is to say through 1,000 small moments that nobody ever talks about. She carried her own weight. She carried other people's weight when they were hurt. She never asked for a break she had not earned, and she never took one she could give to someone else. By the end of that first deployment, the battalion surgeon told her that if she wanted to keep going, there was a door even narrower than the one she had already walked through, and a unit that occasionally needed a medic who could attach for specific missions when the operational requirements called for one. He did not name the unit. He did not have to. Elena said yes again, and the second yes set the rest in motion. The SEAL team chief who first met her at a remote staging area in the Horn of Africa was a man named Master Chief Bo Hollister. And he had the kind of face that looked like it had been carved out of something the wind had been working on for 40 years. He did not shake her hand when she stepped off the helicopter. He looked at her plate carrier, at the medical kit on her back, at the way she carried her rifle, and he said only, "We start at 0400. Elena understood immediately that nothing she had done before that moment mattered to him, and nothing she said in the next 24 hours would matter either. The only thing that would matter was what she did. So she did. She ran their pace. She drank their water schedule. She listened more than she spoke, and when she spoke only about medicine. Because she had learned that the fastest way to be respected in a room of men who knew exactly what they were doing was to be the person in that room who knew exactly what she was doing. The team had a corpsman of their own, of course, a senior chief named Reyes who had been operating for 19 years and who treated Elena, in the beginning, with the careful neutrality of a man who had seen attachments come and go. But on the third night, during a rehearsal of a cordon and search drill on a mock compound built in the desert, one of the operators rolled an ankle badly coming off a wall, and Elena was on him before Reyes had even finished turning around. She taped the ankle with a speed and economy of motion that came from doing it 500 times in the dark, and Reyes watched and said nothing. And the next morning he handed her a cup of coffee without a word, and that was how it began. She learned the team's rhythm. She learned that Hollister hated repeated questions and loved precise ones. She learned that the youngest operator, a kid from Montana they all called Wit, hummed a country song under his breath every time he was nervous, and that the team leader, a lieutenant named Caldwell, never slept more than 4 hours and could read a room faster than anyone she had ever met. She learned, most importantly, that being the only woman in a SEAL element was not about proving anything. It was about disappearing into the work so completely that her gender became the least interesting fact about her. The mission that would change everything came 6 weeks later, when a high-value target the agencies had been tracking for 2 years surfaced briefly in a village in a country whose name she was not allowed to write down. The brief was short. The window was 48 hours. Caldwell looked around the room at the end of the briefing, his eyes resting for half a second on Elena, and he said, "We're taking the medic." He did not specify which medic. He did not have to. Reyes nodded once. Elena packed her kit that night with the calm hands her mother had given her, and at 0300 the next morning, she was in the helicopter, headed for the longest night of her life. The compound was supposed to be quiet. It was not. Whatever intelligence had placed the target in a single sleeping room with 2 guards had missed the fact that a second element of fighters had arrived sometime in the previous 6 hours, and the team came under fire almost the moment the first breacher placed his charge. Elena stayed on the rooftop with Wit and a sniper named Park while the rest of the element moved through the structure below. She heard the first detonation. She heard the second. She heard Caldwell's voice on the radio, calm in the way men like him are always calm, calling out the room they had cleared and the room they were moving to. And then she heard the third explosion, which was not theirs. A rocket-propelled grenade struck the eastern corner of the rooftop, and the world became, for a brief and complete second, only sound and pressure. When Elena came back to herself, she was on her side, her cheek against gravel, and Whit was screaming for her without making any noise she could hear. The sniper, Park, was crawling toward the parapet with one arm that no longer worked. She moved before she thought. She moved the way she had been trained to move, which is to say automatically, her body executing a sequence her mind had not yet caught up with. She got to Park first because he was bleeding the fastest, and she clamped the artery in his upper arm with a tourniquet she had pulled from her kit before she registered that her own left side was wet. She moved to Whit next, who had taken shrapnel in the thigh and was conscious and swearing and entirely savable, and she worked on him with both hands while the firefight continued one floor below. It was only when she reached for a second pressure bandage and her left arm refused, for the first time in her life, to do exactly what she told it to do, that she looked down and saw the dark spread along her side and understood. She had perhaps 3 minutes before the blood loss began to affect her cognition. She had perhaps 8 before it would affect anything else. The radio in her ear crackled. Caldwell was calling for a casualty report from the rooftop, and the operator who should have answered, the senior corporal who had been the fourth man on the roof with them, was lying 10 feet away and would not be answering anyone again. Elena keyed her mic. She gave the count. She gave the wounded. She did not include herself in the wounded, because she had made a calculation in the half-second before she spoke, and the calculation was this. If she went on that list, the team would split its attention, and the team could not afford to split its attention. So she said nothing about the wet warmth running down inside her trouser leg, and she pressed her good hand harder against Whit's thigh, and she waited for the next thing she would have to do. The next thing she had to do was stand up. The team was pulling back to the rooftop for exfil, and the helicopter was inbound, and Park could not walk, and Whit could not walk, and the corporal would never walk again. And Elena was the only person on that rooftop with 2 functioning legs, even if one of her arms was no longer entirely hers. She put her back against the low parapet wall and pushed. She got halfway up and the world tilted, and she put her back against the wall again and breathed the way her mother had taught her to breathe when she was 9 years old and afraid of a thunderstorm. Slow in through the nose and slower out through the mouth, and she pushed again. She got to her feet. She did not make a sound. The team came up the stairwell in a tight stack, Caldwell first, Reyes second, and Reyes saw her face before anyone else did and understood immediately what she had not said on the radio. He moved toward her, and she shook her head once, hard, and pointed at Park and Reyes, who had been operating for 19 years and who knew exactly when to argue with a fellow medic and exactly when not to, when to park. The helicopter came in low and fast and loud, and the team loaded the wounded in an order Elena had helped to tree off, and she was the last one on, walking under her own power. Because she had decided on the rooftop that she was going to walk onto that helicopter, and she was a person who, once she decided a thing, did the thing. It was only when the bird lifted off and the door gunner began his sweep that Reyes finally got his hands under her plate carrier and felt what she had been hiding. And he looked at her with something that was not quite anger and not quite admiration and said, in a voice she could barely hear over the rotors, "Vargas, you are an unbelievable pain in my ass." She smiled, because she could not yet laugh, and she said the 6 words she had whispered into the dust before she stood up. The 6 words that would later be repeated in classrooms and quiet conversations. She said, "Not yet. Not here. Not them." Reyes worked on her for the entire flight back to the forward surgical team, and the surgical team worked on her for 4 hours. And she lost a great deal of blood and a small piece of her spleen and a larger piece of the certainty she had carried since she was 19 that her body would always do what she told it to do. She woke up 2 days later in a hospital bed in Germany, and the first face she saw was Master Chief Hollister, who had flown out personally, and who did not say anything for a long time. And then said only, "Your brother called. I told him you were okay." And then, after another long moment, he added, "You were." Recovery was harder than the rooftop, in the way that recovery always is. Because the rooftop had given her something to do, and the hospital gave her nothing but time. She did the physical therapy. She did the second surgery. She did the long, quiet weeks of sitting with what had happened, and what had almost happened, and what she had decided in the half-second before she keyed her mic. She thought about the corporal on the rooftop, whose name was Daniel Reeve. And she wrote a letter to his mother in Tennessee that took her 3 weeks to finish and that she would never feel was good enough. She thought about Whit, who recovered fully and who sent her a card with a picture of a mountain on it and 3 words inside, written in the cramped handwriting of a man who did not write often. The words were, "Thank you, ma'am." She thought about Park, who kept the arm. She thought about her own mother, who had flown to Germany and who had sat by her bed for 9 days without complaining about the food or the cold, and who had said, on the last night before she flew home, "Mija, you do not have to prove anything to me. You did not have to prove anything to me when you were 9. Elena had not known until that moment that she had been proving anything to anyone, and the realization sat with her for a long time. She went back to the regiment eventually. She passed the medical board. She returned to the kind of work she had chosen, but she returned to it differently, because the rooftop had taught her something she would spend the rest of her career trying to teach others. The lesson was not that she was tough. She had always known she was tough. The lesson was that toughness without judgment was a liability, and that the moment she had decided not to put herself on the casualty list had been the right decision only because she had made it cleanly, with full information, for the benefit of the team and not for the benefit of her own pride. The difference between those two motivations was the difference between a good medic and a dangerous one, and she began, slowly, to teach younger medics how to tell them apart. She taught them that the body would lie to them, and that the mission would lie to them, and that the only thing that would not lie was the discipline they had built in the years before anyone was shooting at them. She taught them that leadership was not about being the loudest person in the room, but about being the most useful one. She taught them that a team is not a collection of individuals. It is a single organism, and a medic's job is to keep that organism alive, even when one of its cells is her own. She was promoted. She was decorated. She was, eventually, sent to teach at the very schoolhouse where she had once been a student, and the young soldiers in her classroom did not always know, at first, what she had done. She preferred it that way. There is a story they tell now, in certain quiet rooms, about a medic on a rooftop who said nothing about her own wound until every other wound had been addressed, and who stood up under her own power when the helicopter came, and who walked onto that bird because she had decided she was going to. The story is true, but it is not the whole truth, and Elena Vargas, when she hears the story repeated, is careful to say so. The whole truth is that she was afraid. The whole truth is that her hands shook when she put the tourniquet on Park, and that she nearly passed out twice before the helicopter arrived, and that the 6 words she whispered into the dust before she stood up were not a battle cry, but a prayer, the kind of prayer a person makes when they are not entirely sure anyone is listening. Not yet. Not here. Not them. What she means, when she explains it to her students, is that courage is not the absence of fear or the absence of pain. It is the decision, made in the smallest available second, to give what you have to the people who need it more than you do. It is the discipline that lets you make that decision cleanly. It is the team that makes the decision worth making. Elena Vargas is still serving today. The notebook in her left breast pocket has more names in it now than it did on her first deployment, and the marks beside the names tell a story she does not share easily. But if you ask her what her story represents, she will tell you it is not really her story at all. It is the story of every quiet person who decided, in the dust of some rooftop nobody will ever name, to rise. And if her story makes you want to rise too, then she would tell you the same thing her drill sergeant told her on the first morning at Fort Jackson. The world does not care what you have survived to get here. It only cares what you are willing to survive next.